Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 247, and this is for our class for Thursday, June 18th, where we are in the midst of talking about Jane Eyre. I am also in the midst of evaluating your papers, which I will be returning to your email since I asked that you send me the papers via email because that's how my grading program works best. And in terms of Jane Eyre, this is a long text. I had suggested that if you wanted a bit of assistance, you might want to see a version of Jane Eyre. And I recommend anything from the BBC because they usually do pretty accurate adaptations. I make the same recommendation in my Shakespeare class as well. But there are certainly many adaptations of Jane Eyre, but Jane Eyre is a long book. So more often than not, what you're going to get are cuts in adaptations. And of course, we know that watching an adaptation is never a substitute for reading, it's a supplement for reading. And I had suggested that perhaps you might want to think of Jane Eyre as separate books because ultimately that might make the reading exercise go a little bit more quickly. Thinking about it as book one being about Gateshead, the first 4 chapters. Book 2 being about Lowood, chapters 5 through 10. Book 3 being about Thornfield, chapters 11 through 27. Book 4 being about Moor House, also known as Marsh End, chapters 28 through 35. And lastly, Ferndean, which is chapters 26 through 38. So I wanted to talk a little bit about those, and you can see that in the notes below. Names are going to be very important in this particular text because they oftentimes serve as foreshadowing, as of hints of what will be occurring in the reading. So if you think about something like the name Gateshead, for instance, a gate leads to entrapment. However, you can open the gate and you can have freedom. This is what we will see happening to a young Jane Eyre. We know that what we've got is the story that's narrated by an adult Jane Eyre looking back on her childhood. And the story begins with what seems to be very minor, that there was no possibility of a walk that day. But that reinforces the theme of confinement, especially for Jane. And she's sitting cross-legged, which is the exact opposite of what you would think a girl or a woman would be doing during the time period. So we see already how Jane defies some of the gender expectations of her time. Not only is she sitting cross-legged, she's reading. And we know, of course, the dangers that can be associated with reading on a dreary November day, because this text is also a Gothic text, much like Frankenstein. So atmosphere is going to be so important. We see how a young Jane is quite rebellious. In chapter 2, for instance, she resists punishment. She's basically teased by her cousin John, and when she tries to defend herself, she's the one who's blamed. And as she resists the punishment that results, she says, "This was a new thing for me." And she's taken to the Red Room. Now, she's 10 years old at this time. The Red Room is also very Gothic, and it comes with all kinds of folklore associated with ghosts and so forth. And in chapter 3, an adult Jane reflects, I ought to forgive Mrs. Reed. We know that Jane is an orphan. We know that she's motherless. This is a theme that we've seen throughout the semester. Not that I planned it that way, but nevertheless, it seems that what we've got are central characters who are lacking mother figures. And Jane isn't welcome into the family the way the other family members are welcome. And Jane is basically at the whim of her I should say her aunt, Mrs. Reed. Think about the name Reed, something that's thin and brittle, so it's something that's negative. Mrs. Reed spoils her own children, but treats Jane very badly because Jane is an orphan and because Jane is not attractive. She's a plain Jane, so to speak. And also because Jane doesn't have income. She doesn't have money. She doesn't have status. And we've learned how important that is after reading Persuasion. And one of the things that Jane talks about is that she ought to forgive Mrs. Reed as an adult, but the child, Jane, didn't want to belong to poor people. So the importance of caste, the importance of the social station of an individual. In fact, the quote reads, or a quote reads, "I was not heroic enough to purchase liberty at the price of caste." The backstory: Jane's birth mother had married a poor clergyman. We saw a little bit of this in Persuasion, where it would be possible from somebody from a higher class to marry a clergyman, even though they didn't necessarily have money, but at least they had some level of status. But it would be something that would raise eyebrows in the family, which is exactly what happened. So basically, what we've got is Jane's mother defying the familial expectations of who she would marry. And we know how important it is to have a good match. We talked about this with Persuasion. So basically, Jane's mother married a poor clergyman, and as a result, she was disinherited. And Jane's parents both died when they were both serving in their religious functions. And the mother's brother, Mr. Reed, had took in Jane. Mr. Reed died, and now Mrs. Reed, his wife, is responsible for raising Jane, which she does so begrudgingly and doesn't treat Jane particularly well. In the fourth chapter, we see how Jane is introduced to a Mr. Brocklehurst. So basically, one of the critiques of this novel is about organized religion and how cold and unyielding and hypocritical it can be, as is illustrated in Mr. Brocklehurst, who's described as a kind of black pillar, a rigid, hypocritical religion at Lowood boarding school. And boarding schools at the time were known for having very poor conditions for their students. And that's also one of the things that's critiqued, I should say, in Jane Eyre. And we know that Mrs. Reed basically is beside herself and wants to send Jane away to school. And Mr. Brocklehurst is interviewing a young Jane, only 10, remember, and asks Jane how she will avoid hell. Jane's response, one of my favorites, by not dying. So we see that this is a sassy, independent child and a sassy, independent female. And she is able to tell her aunt, Mrs. Reed, that Mrs. Reed is a bad, hard-hearted, and deceitful person. So Jane isn't pulling any punches here. We definitely see a very strong central character in a way that we didn't see with an Anne Elliot, let's say, in Persuasion. Can you imagine Anne Elliot speaking this way? So, as we move into what I call book 2, we go into Lowood. It's a place that's low, it's a place that's poor. That's the boarding school, which has primitive conditions. So, we are exposed to these primitive conditions. Again, one of the ways that Charlotte Bronte is critiquing the boarding school system of the time, with lots of deprivations, but this is also where Jane meets a very central character, Miss Temple. Think about the last name of Temple. Temple is a place of safety. It's a place of, let's say, of comfort. It's a place where ultimately Jane is able to learn, love, and achieve a certain level of safety. In other words, Miss Temple is Jane's safe temple, if you will. Jane also makes a friend, Helen Burns. And might I suggest that Helen Burns burns an impression on Jane. Helen Burns very much is religious. And what we will see throughout this text is that Jane's religion, her spirituality, is not based on hypocrisy. It's based on a direct connection to God, an appreciation of nature, something that actually we are going to see when we talk a little bit about Emily Dickinson. And one of the things that a young Jane has to learn, because at first a young Jane says, if others don't love me, I'd rather die than live. She says that in chapter 8. I cannot bear to be solitary and hated. And one of the things she has to learn is to love herself. Think about how contemporary this is in so many respects. Helen eventually dies, perhaps because she is so absorbed with the idea of the afterlife that she can't appreciate the here and now of the natural world, which is something that Jane can. And one of the things we'll see with Jane Eyre, which was similar with Persuasion, was the idea of balance and to avoid extremes. And Helen is definitely one extreme about deprivation for the religious afterlife. And the other extreme, of course, is just living in the moment in sin and comfort. And that's something that we see with Mrs. Reed and also Jane's cousins, um, the Reed children. We find out what happens to them as the novel progresses when they become adults. And none of them have terribly good fates. But Helen dies of tuberculosis, which was not uncommon at the time. It was known as consumption. And Jane lives. And Jane appreciates the healing power of nature. If you're thinking about Frankenstein, you should, because we talked about the idea of nature as Mother Nature and the universal mother. And Jane talks about how the world is pleasant, it'd be dreary to be called from it. So, what we learn in chapter 10 is a result of all of the sickness and death that occurred at the boarding school led to investigations and ultimately improvements made to the school. And Jane finds a quote, new servitude, unquote. Servitude and mastery is a theme in the actual text. By ultimately boldly advertising for employment as a governess, Jane grows up, begins teaching at the boarding school, and now Miss Temple marries. Of course, as a married woman, she's not allowed to retain her profession as a teacher. Jane realizes that without Miss Temple, that there really isn't anything holding her to Lowood, so Jane decides that she wants to try something new. And she is, again, very unusual for a female at the time period. The idea of boldly advertising for employment as a governess is huge for someone Jane's age, for someone in Jane's gender, for someone's of Jane's socioeconomic status. Um, and she does find employment. And this is where we get into what I call the third book. And this would be Thornfield's estate. And when you think about Thornfields, I mean, field is something that's positive and green and luscious and welcoming. A thorn can lead to pain and dismay and the spilling of blood. So there will be both positives and negatives with Jane Eyre at this location, where she meets the housekeeper, Mrs. Fairfax. And Mrs. Fairfax talks about how the other employees there are only servants, and that she can't converse with them on terms of equality. We talked a little bit about this in Frankenstein as well when we were talking about Walton and Victor, that we certainly see, a certain level of concern with social status. So as progressive as these authors might be, they still are influenced by the social norms and expectations of their time. Jane is going to be the governess for Adele Varennes, a child who is the ward of someone named Mr. Rochester. He's the master of Thornfield's estate. And the rumor is that Adele Varennes is the illegitimate child of Rochester's, that this child was abandoned by its mother, and Rochester has taken responsibility for the child. And this is where we're introduced to the Gothic plot, where there is this strange laughter in this estate coming down the hallway, and it seems very ghost-like. So there's a mystery that needs to be solved. Jane talks about, very tellingly in chapter 12, that human beings must have action. Women, in particular, are supposed to be very calm generally, but women feel just as men feel. They suffer from too rigid a constraint, too absolute a stagnation. It's narrow-minded to say they ought to confine themselves to making puddings and knitting stockings, to playing on the piano and embroidering bags. Now, this is something that we saw at the ending of Persuasion, where we've got Anne Elliot talking about the idea of women needing to be able to tell their own stories, but this commentary is much more blunt about the importance of a woman having the opportunities that have been denied to female traditionally during this time period. We know how important a walk can be, as we saw with persuasion, and we will see this as well in chapter 12, that Jane is going outdoors. Remember, at the beginning, we were told that a young Jane, there was no possibility of a walk at that point because of the weather. Jane is outdoors. She's posting a letter. Of course, the idea is that the home was oftentimes viewed as a kind of prison for female, and the outdoors led to the possibility of meeting other people and engaging in other activities, which is exactly what happens to Jane as she's outdoors posting a letter for Mrs. Fairfax. Jane meets and helps, of all people, it turns out to be Mr. Rochester, who is the master of the estate. He's 20 years Jane's senior. There are lots of things going on in this text. It is a Gothic text, but it also is a romance as well. And we will definitely see a romance develop with Jane and Rochester. Usually that's what film adaptations focus on, that particular romance. But there's a lot more that's going on here. He falls off his horse, and Jane is pleased to have done something to assist him, an active thing. And she describes Rochester as masculine, dark, strong, and stern. Very much in the Byronic tradition of the hero, a male who needs to be humbled and learn some lessons, which is what we will see here. Very much in the romantic tradition. And also the idea of Jane being active and being capable. And we saw how important it was for Anne Elliot to be capable as well in persuasion. Jane shows all kinds of strength and independence to Rochester, who inherited Thornfield after his older brother died. So we're being given little clues here as to how this novel is going to end. But of course, with all of this foreshadowing, we don't necessarily know that until we get to the ending. Rochester asks Jane if he's handsome. Jane says no, which is not the way she's supposed to respond to her employer. Rochester asks Jane to speak. She remains silent and eventually states that nothing freeborn would submit to insolence, even for a salary. And Rochester is captivated by the fact that Jane is so different from any of the other females that he's with. And we do know that at chapter 15, part of the mystery is that Rochester's bed is set on fire, and there's that eerie laughter that's going on too. There is supposition that perhaps the servant Grace Poole is responsible. Jane assists Rochester. It'll be important that it's the bed that's set on fire, because when we find out the reason why there is a laugh, it's definitely related to the marriage bed. And I hope I'm not giving away too many spoilers here. Rochester is a complex character. We're supposed to like him, but he does some rather mean-spirited things. He basically tries to make Jane jealous by bringing his beautiful, vain, arrogant girlfriend, whom he has no intention to commit to, Miss Blanche Ingram, and his friends to Thornfield, and he demands that Jane keep in their company, even though they are above Jane's social status, and she's very uncomfortable. And at this point, Jane has fallen in love with him, and she says that she doesn't condemn him for marrying for only interest and connections, because this is what was expected at the time, as we saw in Persuasion. We are introduced to another character who mysteriously arrives from Jamaica, chapter 18, a Mr. Mason. And then in another problematic episode where Mr. Rochester, to try to make Jane jealous and also perhaps to make Jane suffer a little bit, pretends to be a gypsy woman and reads Jane's fortune and says, "You are cold because you are alone. No contact strikes the fire from you that is in you. You are sick because the best of feelings, the highest and the sweetest to man, keeps far away from you. You are silly because suffer as you may, you will not beckon it to approach, nor will you stir one step to meet it where it waits you." And The gypsy woman, aka Rochester, continues and says that James Brown professes to say, I can live alone if self respect and the circumstances require me to do so. I have an inward treasure born with me which can keep me alive if all extraneous delight should be withheld or offered only at a price I cannot afford to give. Which is exactly what's going to be happening again, but we're going to have to read the novel to see how that comes to fruition. In chapter 20, Jane nurses Mr. Mason. Remember when we were talking about the cult of true womanhood and that one of the ironic ways that a woman could gain power and status in society was through nursing? And we see this with Jane taking care of Rochester and now Jane taking care of Mr. Mason. And one of the things that Jane says is, if anyone you know has suffered an error, let him look higher than his equals for strength to amend and solace to heal. Again, the importance of a higher power in God and true spirituality, not the hypocritical religion of mankind. We find out that Mrs. Reed, remember her, she is now on her deathbed and is called for Jane, and Jane attends, even though they have a very complicated history. So Jane goes back to where she spent her childhood to find out that John Reed, one of her cousins, the one that treated Jane so badly, has died, probably by suicide. He has kept some pretty bad company as an adult. And she finds that her other cousin, Georgiana, has become a spoiled, arrogant woman looking to marry a rich suitor. I can't help but think of someone like Mary Elliott in Persuasion. And the other cousin, Eliza, has become a cold, distant religious woman planning to join a nunnery. Again, the critique of organized religion where you have to give up your humanity in order to embrace God. And then Mrs. Reed, even though she's on her deathbed, she refuses to accept Jane's reconciliation. So Jane attempts to make amends. Jane has a much richer character than Mrs. Reed ever could, who's very petty and is going to reveal that there was a letter that she had received years ago and had kept it hidden, that Jane does indeed have family. She's not just an orphan. There's a distant uncle who's looking to adopt Jane. Of course, that's what Jane has been looking for her entire life. She's been looking for love and she's been looking for family. When Jane returns, Rochester finally admits that he loves Jane and he proposes to Jane while he's smoking a cigar. Anybody who is a Freudian knows that a cigar is a phallic symbol. There definitely is sexual tension between the two. He admits that he tried to make her jealous and lightning strikes, and literally, and splits a chestnut tree. Again, some foreshadowing about some ominous events that are going to be going on. By chapter 24, Rochester wants to spoil Jane. Remember, Rochester comes from a good amount of wealth. He wants to give Jane silks and pearls, but Jane refuses and states, I will not be your English Celine Varennes. I shall continue to act as Adele's governess, and by that I shall earn my board and lodging. And you shall give me nothing. And that was a good way to keep him in reasonable check. So what we've got is a text here that talks about how to manage relationship and about how to get the upper hand, and also a text that talks about Jane having a certain level of integrity that really cannot be broken, and that will be tested very soon. When first Jane has some rather disturbing dreams right before her wedding and finds that her wedding veil is ripped in two. And of course, that will be important when we find out the big reveal, which is in chapter 26, that Mr. Rochester is still married. This was to Mr. Mason's mad sister, Bertha, the mad woman in the attic, if you will, and hidden by Grace Poole and Thornfield. That explains the mystery about the laugh. It explains the mystery of how and why Mason was attacked. It explains the mystery of Rochester's bed being put on fire. And She is a fascinating character. The idea of Bertha, who represents the non-European, the other. And if you know anything about Wide Sargasso Sea, which was a novel that was written by Jean Rice, it is the story of Bertha. So this is another author who's given us another narrative about Bertha's past and how she would have ended up with someone like Rochester. So if you are inclined, you might want to read that text one day, though I'm quite aware that I'm keeping you quite busy right now with the readings that we have. And once Jane finds out that Rochester is married, she refuses to commit polygamy. So this is where we see Jane's integrity. And in chapter 27, Jane thinks, "None shall help you. You shall yourself pluck out your right eye." That'll be important when we see what happens to Rochester by the ending of the novel. "Yourself cut off your right hand." That also is some foreshadowing of what will happen to Rochester at the ending of the novel. She resists the temptation of becoming Rochester's mistress. She's tempted, but she refuses to do so, and tells Rochester, "Do as I do, trust in God and yourself. Believe in heaven, hope to meet again there," thinking, "I care more for myself. The more solitary, the more friendless, the more unsustained I am, the more I will respect myself." Think about the strength of character for a female to think in this way and to act in this way during this time period, or even in contemporary times. This is where, in chapter 28, Jane flees into nature. If you're familiar with Shakespeare, you might be familiar with King Lear. And King Lear is a wonderful story where ultimately our main character goes into the natural world, nature, and has to experience all kinds of deprivations. So there's some parallels here. But Jane flees into nature. She calls nature the universal mother, who is benign and good. And Jane is able to get shelter. Jane is penniless. She's alone. She suffers physical and emotional pain, has to reduce herself to becoming a beggar. So part of Jane's pride is one of the problems that Jane needs to address. And Jane is not perfect, but Jane is certainly better off than many of the other characters in terms of her morality. And then finally, she's rescued, coincidentally, by a Rivers family, Mary, Diana, and St. John Rivers. And they live at Marsh End, also known as Moor House, which is one of the other texts that I had suggested you could think of being embedded within Jane Eyre. Marsh End, this is going to be the end of a marsh or the end of pain for Jane. Moor House, this is going to be the beginning of something more for Jane. And Jane, basically passes out and then awakes 3 days later. 3 is such a symbolic number. It's not just a physical rebirth, but it's also spiritual rebirth. In Christianity, 3 is about resurrection. And one of the things that Jane tells the housekeeper is that poverty is not a crime. Think about Jane's transformation from being a child who thought that it was better to be abused by the Reeds than to live a life of poverty, to having to actually deal with being poor and realizing that there's nothing negative associated with that. And Jane bonds very much with the females of the household, Mary and Diana. And St. John, she has sort of a tense relationship with him. He offers her, and he's a clergyman, a humble job of teaching poor children. Remember, Jane has worked as a governess and has been basically teaching a wealthy child, a privileged child. Jane accepts, and what the Rivers family finds out, we might have to suspend a little bit of disbelief here, that their long-lost Uncle John has died and not left them an inheritance. This will be important for Jane as the novel progresses. Jane admits in chapter 31 she feels degraded by the ignorance, the poverty, the coarseness of her pupils, but knows that these feelings are wrong and she shall strive to overcome them. St. John, the missionary, however, struggles with his attraction to a rich, vivacious woman, Miss Oliver, and his desire to become a missionary and become cold, hard, and ambitious, and basically give up his life in service of God. And what St. John decides to do is that he is going to follow a missionary's life, and he wants Jane to join him. What St. John learns is that Jane Elliot, which is the pseudonym that she's been using, no connection to Persuasion, by the way, even though that was an Elliot family, is really Jane Eyre, who is being searched for by Rochester, because you'll remember that Jane fled into nature after she found out that Rochester was married. And then we get another reveal that St. John, Mary, and Diana Rivers are all Jane's cousins. Their Uncle John, who was a rich bachelor, left his inheritance to Jane. And if you haven't figured it out yet, the last name Eyre, E-Y-R-E, sounds just like heir, H-E-I-R, that Jane is the heir. So we got the clue right from the very beginning. We know that Jane is plain Jane, ordinary Jane, but also Jane will end up being the heir to quite a bit of fortune, but more importantly from Jane's perspective is that she is going to be the heir of family, which is what she always wanted. And ultimately, the sister who married a poor clergyman was disinherited, if you'll remember. But of course, John, the rich uncle, who's a bachelor, he left his inheritance to the niece that he never met. And he cut out basically the Rivers family, and in revenge against the idea of the fact that the Rivers mother had married a poor clergyman. And at this point, Jane realizes an injustice has been done, and she joyfully, fairly shares her fortune with her cousins. So we're headed towards a happy ending. St. John proposes to Jane to be a missionary's wife and serve with him in India to serve God, but Jane refuses because, remember, this is a romance as well. And in order for Jane to be true to herself, and this is a heroine who will be true to herself, she has to follow her heart, and that means Rochester. So in chapter 35, we go back to Rochester. We see and read about something that could have some supernatural element to it to go with the Gothic story, where Jane hears Rochester's voice from afar calling her, and Rochester in turn hears the same from Jane. So Jane returns to Thornfield to find out that it was destroyed, ravaged by fire. This is where we find out that Rochester's first wife died in the fire, though he tried to save her. So the idea is that he's shown some honor. And Rochester has been maimed, but he's not killed. And he now is blind. And if you know anything about Oedipus the King, a great Greek drama, you know how you can be blind physically but have insight. And basically, Rochester needed to be humbled as well, which is something that happens after he's been maimed. And he's now residing in his secondary residence, which is called Ferndean. If you think about something like a fern, it's something that's green and growing. So this is a place of possibility. And Jane returns to Ferndean. Now she has family, so she's not alone. She's independent because she has financial security because she has an inheritance. And now Rochester is the one who's been humbled. He's the one who's dependent because he suffered some physical consequences of that fire. And Jane is going to be the leader in that relationship as she cares for Rochester. So we see a switching of roles here, so that we can get a happy ending in chapter 37, where Jane has been married for 10 years. Remember that we had talked about Jane as an adult female author, looking back at her past. She has a son, which means she's made her own family with Rochester, and even some of Rochester's sight has returned. So this gives you an idea of the novel Jane Eyre. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the themes next class. You can see that I put some of them here about gender and class and religion, hypocrisy and honor. And I also wanted to introduce Emily Dickinson. And if you're wondering about Emily Dickinson, because I had assigned Emily Dickinson, but I did not give any page numbers. What I'm going to be doing is showing us a documentary about Emily Dickinson. And then for the attendance question, I'm going to be asking you to choose one of her poems. So you have quite a bit of options because she wrote over 1,000. Not that I'm expecting you to read all 1,000. And to talk a little bit about why you would have chosen that particular poem. So I did order a text with some of Emily Dickinson's poetry, and I will be providing a website with some of Emily Dickinson's poetry. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges of reading Emily Dickinson's poetry. But before that, I wanted to put closure onto Jane Eyre next class. And for our discussion forum question for today, which would be due on Saturday and the 20th. And as always, if you need additional time, please let me know. As always, you're not required to respond to your classmates, but you certainly are encouraged to. As always, you are required to read your classmates' responses and my responses in turn. That'll give you a good idea of what we would have talked about in class. The question is about the novel Jane Eyre, which you may or may not have finished by this point. I'm well aware of that. So I'm hopeful that by our next class on Tuesday, you would have completed Jane Eyre. So you can think of Emily Dickinson as kind of our break for catching up before we move to our last novels. To identify one event in Jane Eyre, I've already asked you to identify a quote in Jane Eyre. To identify one event in Jane Eyre that surprised you and indicate why. Again, no right or wrong answer. I'm more interested in your thinking and your reasoning. So next class, we'll put some closure to Jane Eyre. We'll begin talking about Emily Dickinson. And you should expect to be getting your papers back over the next several days. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.